Okay, guys. So that's the penalty for being too lazy to leave. now, now you have to go through more of this. So what we're going to do now is I want to talk about one very specific thing. The first talk was a very general thing. What I'm going to talk about now is decision making and a technique, a tool, maybe a tool would be a better word, to help us make better decisions relevant for all kinds of decisions. Am I going to marry the person? What job should I take? Should we buy this company? Should we sell that company? So just a general thing that I find helpful in decision making. And let me put it in the context of this day. It's drawn from, the Christian tradition more generally, but the way I'm going to present it would be the way that people in Jesuits would learn. But it's a possession of all of us. I'm going to use some of my own language around it. And I guess the one broad point I'd want to make before I get into it is I hope you gathered in the course of my first talk this idea that I feel like there's something deeply spiritual about great leadership. And, often if I'm talking to a business group, of course, I would not talk explicitly about any faith tradition, but I would make that point. And I would say this, and you can imagine who's going to be sitting there in a business group. Some people who are very devout believers, but, atheists, people of all religious traditions. And I would make that point, and I would say this, there are accounting majors here, I'm sure, right? And, okay, so we all know that the place that we're in now has a value on the balance sheet of the university, right? We could say it cost us this much to put it up. We could depreciate it over this many years. We could touch it. Fine. It's tangible. It's a tangible. Now, how about the people who work here, or you guys? What value do you have on the balance sheet? Zero, of course, right? Maybe a little accrued pension. I don't know what your what your setup is here, but basically zero. You're valueless. And every executive I've ever encountered would be the first to say that the truth is the opposite. This is worth almost nothing unless the people who show up every day, I don't know what, are willing to dedicate themselves to a certain purpose, believe certain things, treat themselves each other in certain ways. And these are things that we can't put on a balance sheet. We can't touch them. We can't feel them. In a word, in a gross sense, they're spiritual. They're not material, tangible. They're spiritual things. So I kind of developed this broad idea. This particular conversation is in the context of a broader idea that, we need to have a good spirituality of leadership to be successful. And, people who are in a tradition, I think it gives them a lot of real advantage, huh? Okay, so now with that, let's talk about decision making. And the idea I'm going to try to develop is the importance of inner freedom to make good choices, okay? And we'll work our way around to that. It's going to take a little while. You have to hang with me, and we'll do a case study as we go. Now, everybody knows how to make a decision. Whether you go to a project management class, any kind of class in the world, the textbook will have this kind of thing, right? We need to identify the problem, gather information, analyze the situation, develop options, blah, blah, blah. It's the same. Whether you're in engineering, business, it's the same flow chart they show us. But anyway, we make terribly crappy decisions, And so this is a kind of a paradox or an invitation. Why is it that in some ways we're bad decision makers? So here's one stat, for example. Merger deals fail to produce desired results nearly 75% of the time. So how could it be that, people who are paid, it's not because they don't have enough resources. They have the best paid lawyers, bankers, all the technology you want in the world, and still often they make terrible decisions. And people who've studied it, among the various theories, is that we make bad decisions sometimes because of, our biases or dispositions as we get into the decision. Or the language I'm going to develop is our unhealthy attachments or our unfreedoms. And I'll show you a quote, and then we'll kind of move along and develop the idea. Can you read that from where you sit? Okay, I'll just let you read it. Okay? So what the researchers are saying is, what happens is these people go into the decision, and because of things that are going on inside them, overconfidence, optimism, confirmation bias, there are things going on inside here that lead them into, in the end, making really dumb decisions, even though they might have all the facts that are needed to make good decisions. And the same goes for our own personal lives, of course, in terms of what jobs we accept or relationship decisions we make. And the founder of the Jesuits had this idea. He used the image of a scale at equilibrium, like these balance of scales. And he says, when you enter a decision, you have to make sure that at the starting point, you're like the scale that's imbalanced. And whatever way the evidence stacks up, that's what will drive your decision. But he says a lot of times, what happens is the scale is not equal when we're badly tilted because I don't know what. Because of my own ego issues or my own desire for status or my own need for power or greed or my own fear of making a mistake or my fear of trying something new or what everybody else is doing or, whatever is our demons, that these things are making us unfree. If you kind of follow the idea I'm developing, And therefore, when we come to the facts, we're not at equilibrium. We're not able to evaluate them well enough. And so I'm going to talk about number 2, but basically I think that there are 2 what we might call spiritual pillars of making good decisions. One is that we have some ultimate, I use the word heroism, but some ultimate sense of criterion or purpose or direction or mission or vision or something like that, And when you read a lot of the leadership literature, you see this idea come up in different kinds of ways. Like some of you probably have read, I forget what the guy's book is. Bill North was the chief executive of Medtronic for a number of years. Now he helps at Harvard Business School. And he has this idea of true north. He says like successful executives, they have some sense of, this is ultimately my sense of right or wrong or what's important or something like that, right? And probably a lot of you read Good to Great or parts of Good to Great, huh? And if you did, maybe you know, that, or maybe you remember that one of the ideas that he develops, that Collins develops in that book, is that really great organizations often have what he calls level 5 leaders. And the way you make money as a consultant is just use a complicated term for a very simple idea. All he means when he says that is that their sense of mission or purpose comes first. It gets past their own issues or their own greed or their own desires, So one aspect that we find in people who are good decision makers is that they do have some sense, in the end, this is where we need to go, this is what's important, this is what's ultimately right or wrong. That is kind of out there. And then the second piece is, then they're free. In other words, they're able to make the choice that will best serve the sense of mission. So the 2 of the things have to go on. And we see both things sometimes are not there. In other words, when you get it, you've probably already seen this in your own life. A lot of times, the way people make decisions is there is no sense of true north or any ultimate sense, and so it's all completely expedient. In other words, I make this decision today according to this criterion. I make that decision tomorrow according to a totally different criterion. My whole life or my whole business becomes a kind of a bit zigzag or just reacting to circumstances, no ultimate sense of where we're going, Or I do have a sense of where I'm going, but I'm not able to make the choices that will actually get me there. And I think that, that when we have these 2 things, they help us in 2 important pieces of decision making. One is, let me present it in a positive way and a negative way. In a positive way, I could say, I need to be free from my own fears of making a mistake, my own, the fact that I don't know all the answers, the fact that I might get it wrong. I need to be free in order to make bold enough choices for my business or my life, or creative enough choices, or something like that. Did I say that well enough? Okay, let me show you a couple of fun examples. I don't mean these as scientific, but for example, What career records does Kobe Bryant hold? All right, the answer? Most missed shots. That's the only important record he holds. And so I sometimes use him as an example of, you know, in sports, if you've ever coached people in sports, but life is like this as well, sometimes you see people that they're so governed by their fear of making a mistake, by their fear of trying something, by their fear of really going for it, by their fear of being ambitious in an appropriate way, that they never are able to achieve, you know? And look at old Kobe here, you know, who's a superb basketball player, and this is a guy who's obviously not afraid to miss a shot, since he's missed more shots than anyone else. Another way in which we sometimes are unfree is that we get too attached to the ways we've always done it before, or the ways other people are doing it, or what's expected, or these kinds of things. And let me show you an example that I sometimes use for that. So, which painting doesn't belong? Yeah, I guess most people would say the one in the middle doesn't seem to belong, you know, because the other two are basically the same subject. You know, it's a Pietà, you know, Jesus is dead and his mother is holding him, and the other one is, you know, this guy drinking, eating soup or whatever he's doing. Well, in fact, the fun that I have with it is I want to make the case that the one that doesn't belong is the one on the left. Because the one in the middle and the one on the right are by the same artist, a guy named Caracci. And the one on the left is by a different artist. I think Cogoli, I have his name written down somewhere, I forget now, Cogoli. You know, they're all Italians. And this is the story that I like to tell, that I want to tell, the idea that I want to develop, that I saw the painting in the middle when I went into a museum one time, and I thought, oh, this is an Impressionist painting. You know, a few of you, if you've studied art, maybe you know the one on the right, you know, Van Gogh has this painting, The Potato Eaters. And so when I saw that one on the left, I thought of the thing on the right, you know, and I thought, oh, you know, it's probably something like that. And in fact, the one on the left was painted like at least 200, maybe 300 years before the Impressionists. And the story that I want to develop is that this guy, Caracci, did not grow up in Rome. He grew up somewhere in Italy, and he developed his own style. You know, and there was something very fresh and different and maybe very advanced about it. And because he was so talented, then he got called to Rome, you know, where the Pope is and all the money is. And so he, you know, so he then started to do paintings like everybody else, you know? And it's a very beautiful painting, you know, and he's a very well-respected artist. But, you know, basically he just started to do what everybody else did, because that's what you're supposed to do. And, you know, now if you go to Rome, I don't know if any of you had the privilege to go there, you know, a lot of the churches basically are like free museums. You know, they don't like that that's the way they're used, but it's true. You know, there's beautiful art, and people just walk into these churches to look at the art. And there's one church that has this, on the left is a beautiful painting of Caravaggio, of the crucifixion of St. Peter, you know, who the legend is he's crucified upside down. So that's a very striking painting. And the one on the right is one of these standard paintings by Caracci. And if you go to that church, nobody would ever stop to look at the one by Caracci, because it's the same as what everybody does. You know, they all go to Caravaggio, which is, oh, wow, this is something a little bit different. So the point, in a way, that I'm making here is, you know, sometimes we can get so unfree or so caught up in or so attached by this is the way it's done, or this is the way everybody else is doing it, or this is the way we've always done it before, that becomes the attachment that steers us in the wrong way, you know? So that's a kind of a positive way. We need to be free from the fears or attachments that might hold us back from being creative enough, bold enough, adventuring enough in our own decisions. The negative way I would put it is, we also need to be free enough from the things that could lead us to make really bad decisions. Free from my own greed, my own lust, my own need for power, my own need for status, my own ego, these kinds of things that can lead us into making really bad ethical choices sometimes. And I saw this very interesting piece of research, I'm just going to let you read it, where a couple of business researchers, they read somewhere that apparently there's very good, people who study handwriting now have a very good ability to correlate who's a narcissist just by looking at how people sign their name, you know? So these guys had the idea, these researchers said, gee, I wonder if there's any correlation between narcissists and the quality of their business decision making. So they took the SEC filings, you know SEC filings? Okay, of a number of companies, and they just gave them the signature at the bottom, of course, for the CEO, and they just gave them to the handwriting analyst and said, okay, tell us which ones are narcissists. And then they looked at the financial results of the narcissist companies and the non-narcissist companies. You follow what I say? Okay, and here's what they came up with. I'll let you read it. Nobody's surprised by the last sentence, right? All right. So that's the kind of introduction to the idea, you know, that we need to be free to make choices that'll best serve our mission or objective or what we're supposed to do. And I want to invite us now to do a little case study to practice using this idea. And here's the case study. I saw in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago a narrative of the collapse of one of the big Wall Street banks. And I plucked a number of quotes out of it. They're not going to go in order. You know, they're just random quotes. I plucked them out that I thought, in one way or another, played into this idea of sometimes how people's unfreedoms, enslavements, unhealthy attachments could potentially have led them to have made dumb choices, okay? And I'm going to show you those quotes, and then I'm going to invite you to have a little discussion about whether you could see identify unhealthy attachments that might have led these guys astray, all right? And remember, I introduced so far the idea that, you know, we often make bad decisions because of all kinds of attachments, either, you know, to greed, pride, or arrogance, our sense of status, our own need to be in control, our fear of the future, of trying new things, our fear of failure, the ways we've always done it before, the people we like or don't like, our culture. You know, we all have our own demons. And we're going to look at the case study of this company that in 2007, its market value was $270 billion. In other words, if you bought all the stock of the company, it would have cost you $270 billion. By 2009, you could have bought the company for $20 billion. I think any one of us could have done this well, at least in running this place. You know, I mean, there was only $20 billion of value left to destroy. So basically, these guys drove their bus off a cliff. And could it be, and of course, it was a big systemic failure, right? But could it be that in addition to what was going on outside in the external market, that some of what was going on in their own hearts or guts or whatever way you want to look at it also accounted for some of the bad choices? And now let me let you just read these quotes. Just tell me, I'm not going to comment, just tell me if I go too quickly. Okay, so I want you now to have a little chat with one or two people nearby. And here's the question. What attachments, in the way we've developed this idea, could have led these characters into some of the bad choices they made that destroyed value in their company? greed or loyalty, status, desire to be in control. I give you a little menu here, but you might find other things yourself. Huh? So have a little chat. I'll give you a minute or so, and then let's see what we come up with. Okay, friends, what did we come up with? What about these knuckleheads? What did you discover in your conversation?
The fact that the fishing buddies were, unwilling to maybe question each other, they kind of were both benefiting from this, and so kind of scratching each other's back and maybe too much trust.
Okay, could you hear okay? All right, and so this to me is a great one, because it sort of illustrates to me one of the challenges of organizations and groups and leadership, So we read these first couple slides and we kind of have this suspicion that, the one guy was unwilling to do his job because it's his old pal, and probably not consciously overlooking malfeasance, but he kind of gave him a pass a little bit, and I'm not going to maybe look under the rocks as much as I should. So we kind of get this feeling, And to me, I like this because it's part of the reality of working in groups and organizations, because most of you, I guess, were here for the talk I just gave, and I talked about the idea of loving those you lead, and how one of the ways that you develop loyalty and cooperation among the team is by people knowing that you care about them and so on, right? And so to me, this is one of the dilemmas or challenges for us always in groups, Friendship, loyalty in the group, that's great. Those are good things, right? But we can misuse or abuse all good things, including loyalty and friendship and so on. And we kind of have this idea that because the one guy was in our language, in our technology, so spiritual, so unfree, so enslaved to his loyalty to the one guy, that somehow it got in the way of him doing his job. Okay, great. What else did you see in these guys? Please.
Well, there was one quote about it's difficult to speak truth to power, and I think that the attachment that comes from that is it's really hard to be honest about the future when things right now are looking so good. Because you want to join in. Yeah, you want to join in on that. You want to get to that position because the beginnings are good at that current moment. And so you just hope that you can get a piece of that before it does go off the rails.
Okay, beautiful. So probably you're looking at that, you're reacting to this kind of quote, where you kind of have this idea of there are people hanging around the trading desk saying, oh man, this does not exactly feel right, but I don't say anything. And I like this one also because this is a very human one, and we can all relate to this. I hope you can all relate to this too, because you work in any company, you're going to see this, And we can imagine, in my own mind, I kind of imagine who's involved here. I'm thinking of kind of more junior people. And, look, I'm going to open my mouth, and what's going to happen? I mean, one, nobody's going to listen. I'm going to get my head blown off. And actually, as you say, this is working out okay. I'm getting paid pretty well right now. So I become so attached to whatever, my own fears of telling the truth to somebody who's powerful, or my own comfort with the income and money I'm making, that I'm just afraid to tell the truth. Okay, great. What else did you find with these characters? Please.
Well, sort of in line with what was just said, the numbness that maybe they were facing with the larger reality at hand, and just being so sort of at that 6 feet off the ground rather than 60,000 feet off the ground, and everything else that's going around, even within the industry. So just sort of the unawareness of knowingly not paying attention.
Yeah, the unwillingness to kind of step back, or an ability to step back and see what's the bigger picture here and what's going on. Okay, nice. Okay, somebody give me the obvious one. Nobody's saying because it's so obvious. Yeah, so we look at the, so we look at something like this where a guy's making $30 million a year, and what goes through our mind is, oh yeah, of course, I mean, these guys made terrible trades because, as they say, as long as you could, or was the one that says, as long as you could keep your revenues growing, you could, I forget where the slide, but one that says, as long as you keep your revenues growing, you keep your bonus growing, yeah? But I want to talk to you, I want to say something about greed. I mean, I worked in this business, yeah? I never met a person who knowingly made a bad trade because they thought it would, just because they thought, you know, I'm going to get more of a bonus. I'm sure there are people like that. I never met a person like that. And I think the idea of this spiritual technology, if we could use this word, you know, technology means know-how, right? Technos and logos, it means know-how, you know, and in our modern time, we tend to assume technology only comes out of machines, you know, but in a way, a general point I'm trying to make is, you know, we also have some spiritual technology, you know, some know-how about how to live and make choices and do things. So in the idea of this is not that, you know, greed will often operate on us, or lust or status or ego, in ways that we're not really aware of. That's the whole point of it, you know? So I don't know. The guy who made the dumb trades probably thought he or she was making, you know, good trades, but somehow their judgment is clouded in ways that they're not entirely aware of. You know, and this is another, I think, very real thing. I'm sure you all have friends sometimes who make really bad relationship choices, and it's so obvious to you, and you say, holy cow, why don't they get it? You know, and sometimes for them, there's just some unfreedom going on there. You know, there's something going on that they think they're making good or prudent choices. And the founder of the Jesuits uses a nice image. He says that our attachments, these things, we could compare them to adulterers, you know, people who are having adultery. And he says adulterers operate best in darkness, when nobody knows. And when it becomes known, then often it disappears, you know. And so he's using this analogy. He's saying that our attachments work on us most effectively when we're not aware, really, that they have this kind of grip on us, you know? And so in terms of using this technology, the idea would be, okay, if I have an important decision to make, do I marry this person? Which job should I take? Should we hire this person or fire that person? Should we put the new building up? Should we merge our company? You know, we could use in all kinds of situations. That before I get into the middle of the decision, I'm going to try to inventory, okay, is there anything that could be going on in there that might lead me into a bad choice if I'm not careful? You know? So remember, the early examples we saw were about merger deals gone bad, right? And so those of us who are on the team, or I who am the chief executive, might sit down and say, okay, look, it's going to feel great when I'm on the front page of the newspaper for having done this deal, or it's going to feel great when I'm running a company that's twice as big as the company I have now, or it's going to feel great when my bonus is 50% bigger because I'm running such a bigger enterprise. And let me try to say all those things to myself before I start looking at these spreadsheets to make sure that I could try to filter that out a little bit, you know? So there's the idea. Okay, now, what we just did is, this case study is kind of an exercise in Schadenfreude. Anybody know what Schadenfreude is? Germans have great ways of using one word to capture lots of different ideas. The Germans have a word, Schadenfreude. Schade means sad or shame. Freude is joy. So Schadenfreude is sadness joy, that you take joy or pleasure in someone else's sadness. You know, so everybody hates this guy. He's such a egotist, and he trips and hits his head in the door, and then we all laugh. Oh yeah, you know. And so in other words, we all like the fact that oh, you know, I mean these investment bankers got what was coming to them, and they were all such idiots, and it's so obvious. But the point we really want to get at is to use these tools in our own life to make our good choices. And so I want to invite another little conversation here, which is maybe you could think about and chat about a situation, real or hypothetical, where attachments could lead us or you or an experience where you saw it happen into a bad choice. And if you work here, it could be a hypothetical example in terms of how the university might make a choice. Or if you're a student, it could be, I don't know how clubs work or the choices that come to you in life or will come to you. Is that okay? All right, so why don't you take another couple of minutes, and why don't you have a little chat about a situation where attachments could lead to a bad choice. Okay, friends? Who has a good or interesting case they want to share with us?
It wasn't my idea, but it was a good one. And it's the idea that relationships can sometimes get in the way of good decisions. And it's tricky because relationships are good, and yet when the relationship becomes a priority over another good, that can become problematic.
Yeah, perfect example. It happens all the time. I don't know what was the context in which you discussed it, but I'm the boss. Somebody is going to get promoted now. An opportunity has opened up. We're old pals. We've been working together for 10 years. We came up the ranks together. You've been here 6 months. You're probably better talented for the job, as it turns out, but you've been here 6 months. Who gets the promotion? My old pal, And good to have a pal, that's great. But as you say, in a way, two goods, right? I mean, my job is really to serve the university or the students, and therefore shouldn't I have elevated the person who could best do that, Yeah, okay, nice. What else? Please.
A common idea among us was just the sense of comfort and how that can be a healthy attachment, whether it's where we're working and becoming very comfortable where we are and not necessarily feeling ourselves develop any further and being willing to cut that off from us.
Okay, could you hear? Okay? Okay, beautiful. And I saw heads nodding as you said that. I mean, that is real life. Everybody knows that, and taking risk, career risk or anything like that, it's sometimes very hard to do, the Kobe Bryant, right? I don't want to miss the shot. All right, were you going to say one?
Like the attachment to the status that would come from choosing one decision versus another. If it's maybe not in line with what you're wanting to do, but kind of have a higher status.
Okay, could you hear okay? All right. So the attachment to status and guiding a choice, and in the West Coast it's probably different, but in the East Coast, where does everybody end up working? Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, if they can get an offer. What percentage of them actually want to go there, or in what percent does it actually allow? Remember, the first part of it was to have some sense of direction, true north, level 5-ness, sense of mission. Remember, that was the first thing, and then the second thing was to be free to serve that, right? And so we have loads of people where maybe they have a point of view about this is what life is about, or this is what's important, or this is what I think is meaningful, or this is what I really enjoy doing. But man, I got an offer from Goldman Sachs, I'm going to go to Goldman Sachs, right? Status, greed, money. Please.
One of the interesting ones that came up in our conversation that I had thought about before is this idea of to attach to the future. And sometimes by striving for a particular vision there or something, deferring something to that, we actually miss out on the present. We discount the present.
Okay, nice. Any others? Some people work here, so what's the classic one when you work in a group? So now I'm Ross, right? So I'm Ross, and I have a meeting of the department heads, and gee, look, I have some bad news, and the revenues from tuition are 3% short, and it looks like we're gonna, have to cut 3%, and you're my department heads, and you have a very good reason why she can cut 3% and her, and how about your own budget, by the way? No, let me tell you why I'm different. Huh? So we would say that, she's so attached. Oh, this actually happened here? She's so unfree, she's so attached to her own narrow piece of the world that she can't make choices that serve the good of the institution, yeah? Okay, so let me just share my final idea, and then we can go. So remember I started out with this kind of classic decision matrix, right? This is how we make good choices. And I guess in an indirect way, what I'm inviting us to do is to layer our own spiritual wisdom into these kinds of things, So maybe we're going to insert steps like, before we're analyzing the situation, or, somewhere in there, before we're making a choice, maybe we're also going to look inside, not just look at the data and the facts, but also look inside. Is there anything going on inside me that could make me unfree in front of this decision, And or maybe before I get to the page of developing options, I'm also going to insert a moment of saying, look, let me let me take a step back and remind myself, why are we here anyway? What do we say is the mission? Are we going to put up this new building, or drop this major, or add that major, or open this new center? And actually, before we get into the middle of that discussion, why don't we read the mission statement again one more time and kind of remind ourselves what's our true north here, And, above all, maybe as spiritual people, maybe before we do any of it, maybe we're going to take a moment and say, okay, well, why don't we just call the Holy Spirit into our midst, and pray for enlightenment or something like that, And yeah, present value is really important, but the present value is not the only thing that goes into making good choices, huh? And I introduced during the talk, our little idea of making pit stops, and it turns out that can be a very helpful tool in the broader context of thinking about decisions and making decisions, And maybe if I have a big decision in terms of what job to accept, or what major to choose, or what to do in a relationship, maybe, each day when I make my pit stops, maybe I kind of will bring that up, this choice that's in front of me, and see how it feels. Sometimes over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, something settles one way or the other, I'm just going to bring it up and mull it a bit and see if any light comes to me, and do that again tomorrow. Not feel the pressure to decide it all the first time. I have 3 weeks for the decision. Why don't I just take the 3 weeks and bring it up every day? Okay, I'll kind of finish there. If anybody has any last comment or question, I'll welcome that. Please.
Question. So in a group setting, any group setting, I guess there's always going to be someone as a sour apple. Maybe the first step is to check whether I'm a sour apple or not. But what are your thoughts on dealing with the situations where a person or a couple of people in your group, in any setting, doesn't meet your expectations or values, whether it's drive or integrity or all the other values that you like to.
Right. It sounds like you're asking not in the context necessarily of making a decision, but just in general?
Yes, well, in making a decision as well.
In a decision context, yeah. Well, what I described is something that is kind of an individual inventory, right? I mean, I kind of spoke about it a lot in terms of what's going on inside me, but it's the kind of thing that we could easily adapt to a group setting. And one of the things, thank you for raising the thing you did, because one of the things I sometimes find helpful is that, so now we're going to decide, I don't know what, a potential reorganization of the departments here in the university, and it's possible that one of the group of us that's department heads that are part of this decision, that one of us, our group, is going to go away or get smaller or something like that, or our budget be decreased. And I know, to use your situation, I know that, I mean, this one, it's just all about her, and, you know, she's the bad apple, the sour apple in the group. And if we get into the middle of the discussion and she's being very defensive or something, then for us to confront her, it makes everything even more charged, you know? So sometimes what's helpful is that as the guy who's running the meeting, I could say, you know something, before we get into the middle of actually discussing anything, what if we took an inventory as a group? What are some of the things that could trip us up if we're not careful, you know, in terms of bad dispositions? And then you might say, oh, well, I mean, there's an obvious one. One of our departments might disappear here, and so all of us are going to be tempted to fight for ourselves. And I'm going to say, oh, yeah, great. Why don't I put that up on the board so we can remember that during the conversation? Well, now it's much harder in the middle of the conversation for each of us to lapse into that because we've kind of named it in a way that we didn't accuse you or anybody, you know? And it kind of can disarm that a little bit. So we could imagine how to adapt this individual tool to be useful also to a group making a decision. Okay, thanks so much for coming not once, but twice.